Let me know if you want to share something or feel inspired in the chat. We're still here, moving along. We are building stuff. We are marketing it with beautiful, beautiful designs. We are extending our reality. We are talking about the metaverse, about all this cool stuff, robo ants. It's all going on there. But the next speaker also says, well, that's all good, but it cannot just be about creating this and code implementation. We also have to ask up front before we do these things. Like, what are the questions we need to ask ourselves? What roles does everybody have to play in the team? And she all sums it up in her title of her presentation saying architecting for accessibility, because in the end, people still have to use everything that we're talking about today. And she has good reason to say that because she has a background. She's a Google development expert, UX, UI expert, and she combines her background in psychology, design, and visual communication in her role as the CTO with, I think, a company with one of the coolest names, the Andromeda Galactic Solutions. If she would now say, we have been ruling the galaxy for ages, I would believe it with a company name like that. I'm talking about Martine Dowden. I'm really looking forward to this one. Like I said, architecture for accessibility. I'm checking my backstage to see if our next speaker is ready. Yes, she's popping up. So give me a thumbs up or smile if you are like Marnik. Let me rock this. There you go. Thumbs up. Architecture for accessibility. Martine Dowden, take it away. Have fun. Show is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. Today, as we just heard, I'm going to be talking about accessibility, which when you're just getting started can be quite a little bit intimidating, right? There's a lot to think of. So where do we actually start? So in this talk, I'm going to go over how accessibility relates to the web, more so our standard web application, not some of the cooler technologies that the previous speaker was talking about, but more so our standard web applications. And I'm going to talk specifically about how to get started, what are some questions that we need to be asking as we go along. We're not going to dive into code. We're just going to talk about what are those things we need to think about behind the scenes before we even delve into the application. So accessibility, let's look at a definition first, because accessibility, we hear that word a lot, but we don't necessarily have a good definition for it. And so if we look at what the documentation says, it talks about the ability to interact with a product or service and gain the same benefit from the interaction regardless of the device user capabilities of the users. So in short, we're saying no matter who it is, what it is, and what the capabilities of the users are, we need to be able to use it. And as a developer, that's a really tall order. That's kind of scary, because if we think of all of the devices out there, if we think of all of the things that are available today, from our printers, from our watches, from our, the various computers, even just if we look at phones alone, how many instances of OSs and versions and models there are, that can be pretty intimidating. So there's standards to help us do that, and there's questions that we can ask to kind of guide us down to get the best solution we can get for our users. A quick side note, oftentimes when we talk about accessibility, we see this numeronym A11Y, and all that means is it looks at the first letter, the last letter, and there's 11 letters in between. So if you've ever seen that on the web, it's used on Twitter a lot. That's what that means. It's kind of funny because the accessibility community isn't quite in agreement as to whether the numeronym is accessible, because you have to know what it means to even understand what it means. But, there it is. So I tend to use the word accessibility as much as I can, unless I run out of characters. But, such is life. Moving on. So what does it mean to be accessible? It means that you can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact and contribute to the web. So perceive is, can you understand, can you get the information? So whether that's visually, can you see it? Or if you are visually impaired or using an assistive technology, can you get that information somehow? Can you understand what is on there? Is the language being used? Not necessarily is it in the language that you speak, but is the vocabulary being used understandable to your audience? Can you navigate it? Can you get from one piece of the application to the next? And the contribute part is a little bit, it depends on the circumstance, but in the case of maybe there's a forum or a chat application, or maybe, or if we think of our social medias, can we contribute? Can we add to it? So what are the barriers that keep us from being able to do these things? They can be auditory, things that you hear. That's where things like captions come into play. They can be visual. These are things that you can see. That's where we need to make sure that our applications and our code is written in a way to allow assistive technologies to be able to understand it. Speech, that comes into play with a lot of our, like say if you're developing for Alexa, for example, or for some of the other products, which I will not name in order not to trigger my devices in my home. Physical, these can be anything from what devices can we use to interact with the application. So the standard, if we think of a computer, most people are going to use a keyboard and mouse, but that's not necessarily available to everybody for whatever reasons, either their own limitations, or maybe they're on a device where there isn't a keyboard. So are there other ways that we can find that? Does the application allow for being able to interact with it? The other piece with physical and things that can prevent that can be barriers with physical is stamina, because it's not because you can perform the action once or twice that you can do it over and over and over again. So if you think of typing, for example, that's a lot of keystrokes, right? Can you actually perform that over and over again, or do you end up needing to use an alternative technology because you just, you can't do that multiple times? And the last piece is cognitive and neurological, which are barriers that are a result of a situation or condition affecting the central or peripheral nervous system. And that can be injuries, but that can also be diseases. If you think of Parkinson's, for example, that would fall in that, or epilepsy as well, would fall in those categories. Now, I've neatly categorized these in 5 little groups to make them really easy to talk about, but we need to keep in mind that most of our users are going to have barriers that overlap, right? Several of these categories. Rarely are you going to have a barrier that's in one of those categories alone. I've kind of grouped them that way to make them easier to talk about and to make them easier to define, but rarely is it ever that clean and simple. So how do we get started? We know what our barriers are. We know what accessibility means. How do we get started down this road? Well, the first thing is we need to determine scope. How big of a job is this going to be? And in order to determine scope, we need to understand what standards we're going to follow. Generally speaking, on the web, we're going to use the standard sets by the W3, the World Wide Web Consortium. And so they've set several standards depending on the type of application you're writing. So you have ATAG, UTAG, and WCAG. ATAG is the authoring tool accessibility guideline. These would be for applications that create content. So if you think of your content management systems, right, your CMSs. You have the user agent accessibility guidelines, which are the UAAG, the UTAG. Those are for browsers. So if you were to create your own browser, those are the guidelines you would need to follow. And finally, WCAG, which is when we're writing web applications, is the one we're generally speaking going to be following. And that one's subdivided into 3 categories, A, AA, and AAA, or 3 sets of conformances. And so they build on each other. So level A is your lowest level, your basic level. Then you have AA, which are all of the A standards plus some. And then you have your AAA, which are all of your A and AA standards plus some. And so when we think about accessibility, we think, okay, cool, I'm going to do the best job I can. I'm going to go straight to AA. Well, that's not necessarily a good solution. Generally speaking, AA is more than plenty. We don't need to go all the way to AAA. AAA is generally something that we're going to do if we have a very specific user set that we need, that has a very specific need. And generally, the places that are going to be AAA'd are things that are very specific to that user. Sometimes, if we try to do AA, we can hurt our usability in some cases. So generally speaking, we want to stay at AA. And in most countries, if there is a legal requirement, that's generally where it's going to fall. So And this is where I have to give a big fat caveat that I'm not a lawyer, and in a lot of countries there, and depending on your contract or depending on the type of application you may be building, there may be some legal requirements that you also need to follow. And so that's where you really need to be talking with your legal team when you're deciding, that you're going to go down your accessibility journey, to really understand what standards you're going to follow. So now that once you've established your standards and what you need to, what basically requirements you need to be following, you need to determine, okay, what browsers are we going to support? Because there's a lot of browsers out there. The thing is that as of, and I looked these numbers up yesterday, right now the top 2 are Chrome and Safari, followed by Edge, Firefox, Samsung Internet, Opera, and then a bunch of others. So basically Chrome and Safari realistically are going to be 83% of your market share. So these are definitely some that you're probably going to want to be testing for. After that, that's kind of up to you and depending on your user base. But those are definitely your heavy hitters are going to be Chrome and Safari at the moment. These numbers do change as browsers fall in and out of favor. So keeping kind of in mind what those are. And then if these are worldwide numbers, maybe your area in terms of either your industry or maybe your requirements might have some different user bases. So keeping in mind what your users are using is important. The other thing to keep in mind is things like mobile versus desktop. And one of the errors I've seen often is people saying, well, nobody, like we've got our analytics, nobody uses our stuff on mobile. Why do I need to even worry about mobile? And the answer I always have to ask is it that they're not using mobile because it's not a use case for this application, or are they not using mobile because your application is not accessible on mobile, it doesn't work well on mobile, and therefore they give up and either don't use it at all or go ahead and use it on desktop. So keeping in mind that analytics can lie a little bit in that use case because they're telling you what is currently used, not what could be done. Then we got to look at what technology people are using, and that's where that mobile piece comes into play. And for some things, we can use analytics, right? We can tell we have this many users on this browser, these devices, this is our most common one, etc. One thing we cannot do is figure out through analytics what assistive technologies our users are employing to access our applications. And that's because of a security concern. It is very much obfuscated on purpose because there's a lot of nefarious things we could do if we had that information. And if I know that this user's coming in using a screen reader, for example, I could potentially deduce that this user is blind, and I could use that to discriminate against that user. So these are things that are obfuscated on purpose in order to protect the privacy of our users. However, the WebAIM project did do a survey. So these were willing users that graciously answered this survey and gave some information about the technologies that they use. And they do this survey pretty regularly. This is the results from version 8, which was taken in 2019. And it shows that right now, it's pretty well split up, but it looks like JAWS and NVDA are kind of going to be your top in terms of your usage for your screen readers and in combination with Chrome and Firefox. Worth noting that VoiceOver is what comes default with Mac. And so you're often going to see that VoiceOver with Safari combination together because they come as a screen reader. Most computers at this point come with a built-in screen reader, whether it's Mac or Windows. So those are things that you're going to watch. IE has been sunset at this point by Microsoft, so I'm assuming that the NVDA IE category you see at the bottom will diminish over time as IE is no longer supported. The next piece we're going to want to do is at this point we have an idea of our devices, we have an idea of what we're going to support, is we're probably going to want to start thinking about our accessibility statement. And this statement is for your users. And what it says is basically, it establishes that you have a commitment to accessibility, which standards you're going to use. It tells the user what your standards are, which browsers and tools you're testing against, and what limitations you know exist in your application. So as you start down your accessibility journey, especially if you're fixing a currently existing application, you're going to want to edit this document over time to say, hey, we've so far fixed these portions. So these portions of our application work and have been tested and are accessible, but we still know we have issues in places A, B, and C, for example. So this is going to be a living and breathing document. The other piece with this document is that a lot of times it includes if I'm having issues accessing your website, who should I contact, right? If I'm a screen reader user or maybe a magnifier user and I notice there's a huge issue with this piece of the application, it doesn't work, who can I contact and where can I get support? And that feedback for you is very, very important because it will let you know what the users want to be able to do with your application and help you guide your journey towards making your application more accessible. There's a link here at the bottom from w3.org that is a generator that helps you create that accessibility statement. You basically plug in a little bit of information and it spits out a statement, so it can give you a start on how to write it. I have found it in English. I have not found a way to do it in other languages, but it may be that my browser is set to English, so maybe it is capable of producing in another language if you're coming at it from a browser set in a different language. I'm not sure, but there is a generator out there that can help you get started with that statement. So we have our browser support, we have our technology. Now we need to look at our flows and processes inside of our application. And what I mean by that is, what are our access roles, conditions, data? Like, for example, a lot of applications, maybe you have admin users versus, regular users, and based on their permissions, they can see or not see different things. And we need to know what are all of these paths through our application in order to make sure we are testing and applying our accessibility fixes everywhere in our application for all of our users. So maybe we might focus on one particular user a little bit earlier on. Maybe we want to focus external first and internal second, or maybe it's the other way around, right? We know that internally we have several employees that really, really need this application to be more accessible, so we're going to focus on them first. It really depends. However, understanding what those pathways are and what those user flows are will help you make sure you're not missing any part of your application as you're going about applying your fixes. We also want to understand where our breakpoints are. This happens with like responsive and fluid applications, where we need to understand, okay, we know that on mobile it looks a little bit different than on desktop, right? So we want to make sure that those interactions that might be a little bit different on mobile versus desktop are going ahead and being tested. So a lot of times we can search for things like our media queries in our application, and either for size or for print, to make sure that these are being applied and that these are being tested. Sometimes it's also being handled via JavaScript, so we may need to, kind of look through our JavaScript code as well. But those are kind of ways we can figure out where our breakpoints are for either device-specific things or screen width-specific things. The other piece we need to look at is our third-party integrations. What's interesting with third-party integrations is we don't necessarily have control over their accessibility. Some of them we do, some of them we don't. It depends on what the integration is and what it does and how it's being applied. A lot of time our best bet with our third-party integrations is when we're choosing them at the very beginning, making sure that they're accessible or that they have ways of being made accessible. But that's not always possible. And so that's where that accessibility statement comes back in. So if you have a third-party integration that you have to use for whatever reason and it can't be made accessible, you would mention that in the accessibility statement to say, hey, all of our stuff is accessible except for this one little piece because it's a third-party integration and we're sorry, we can't do anything about it. So that's a place where you would want to address that if that third-party integration can't be changed to something that is accessible or be made to be accessible. How do we go about testing? We can look at our code quality. If our code doesn't parse, it's not going to be accessible. because if parsers can't read it, so accessibility technologies are going to have issues reading it as well. That's less of an issue for things like if you're using like Angular, for example, or if your CSS is written via Sass, because you have a compiler and the compiler will yell at you if there's some code quality issues. However, so other technologies may not have the nearest strong of guardrails, and so making sure that we are linting our code and using validators will help us. Automated testing, these can be done via browser plugins, for example. They can also be done via code things that you add to your pipelines. They know code that you add to your pipeline so that it runs every time your pipelines and your continuous integration works. Two of the ones I really like are accessibility insights for web and Lighthouse. The reason being that the accessibility insights for web has kind of two modes, one of which allows you to test kind of a quick automation, and then has the long version as well, where it shows you all of the manual testing you need to do. Lighthouse is just a quick and easy, will give you that very instant, here's what you're thinking, here's what your kind of code looks at. The thing with automated testing is that it only tests a portion of your application. There's still some things that can only be done manually and tested manually. So for example, your tab order, or whether or not the application makes, when you're listening to it, makes sense, right? Or your all your alternate descriptions for your images that are in your alt tags, do those make sense? Automated testing can't catch that. They can catch whether the tag is there, but they cannot test whether or not the content in there makes sense. So no matter what, you will always have manual testing. Automated testing only gets you started. It does not do the full, the full test. It is not fully done. The last bit is simulators, and I caution with those. Simulators are really nice for things like if you want to take a look at your page from the perspective of somebody that is colorblind. They're great for doing that. The problem with simulators, once you get really involved in it, they tend to instill pity rather than actually helping you move forward. And pity is not what we want. We don't want to pity our users. We want to make a better experience for our users. So be very, very cautious with those. They're not ideal for a lot of things, but they have their uses for, again, things like, how does this look to somebody that is colorblind, for example. Here's a couple simulators that do exist, but again, use them with caution. And lastly is testing with the actual assistive technologies, right? Crack open that screen reader on your computer and give it a try and see how that interaction is. Kind of word of advice on that. If you've never used a screen reader before and it offers a tutorial and a how-to, go ahead and do the tutorial, because those keyboard shortcuts are not anything that you've ever really used before. So go ahead and do the tutorial. You'll thank me later. So how do we know kind of what we need to do. How do we get our team on board? Because right now what I'm presenting is a bunch of extra work you didn't have before you cared about accessibility, right? So if we look at our team, I've broken it down, same way I broke down our barriers into very neat groups. I'm breaking down our team in very neat groups. A lot of times, especially on smaller teams, people will have roles that overlap some of these groups. That's okay. But this is kind of the breakdown I'm using for the purpose of conversation. So we have our leadership. What does our leadership need to be able to do? Well, we need to make sure they're on board, that they're supporting our efforts, right? That they're making our business goal, that they're making sure that accessibility is part of their business goals, and that they're budgeting time and resources towards it, because we may need software. We definitely need more time for development, right? We don't want to add a bunch of extra work on top of our current load and not make sure that time is budgeted for that. Our managers and product owners and business stakeholders are coming to the same idea, right? Accessibility testing takes time. So we need to make sure that that's being allotted for. The other piece is, does our team need training, right? We need to make sure that if the team needs training, there's a budget for that. Our marketing, branding, and design teams, that's going to be really important for our assets. If our style guide at the very base of it is not accessible, if the colors, for example, in the style guide being given by our marketing manager that we must follow is not accessible, we're going to have a really hard time making the application accessible. The other thing is making sure that those visual aspects are already taken care of and understood and agreed upon from the very beginning will prevent friction. A lot of teams I've worked with have friction between the design team and the accessibility team because the accessibility team is telling them, no, we can't use this color combination because it doesn't pass color contrast. And they're saying, yeah, but you're trying to make me make it ugly. Well, it's not about ugly versus workable. It's about finding what will work and coming to a compromise and making sure we're working together to achieve that accessibility goal. Content creators. So this is going to be anybody who's authoring anything, whether it's authoring content to put on our page, whether it's authoring videos. We need to make sure that those are accessible as well as they're getting put into the application. So they're going to have a little bit of work to do on that end too. So if they're producing video, does that video include captions, right? Do we have a caption track being attached and a transcript attached to those videos from the very beginning? When it comes to content, is the vocabulary that is being used accessible to our users, right? So those are things they're going to have probably some process they're going to have to put in place on their ends as well before giving developers the content to implement with making sure that that content stays accessible. Developers, obviously there's code we're going to have to be writing to make things accessible. It doesn't just magically happen because we will it so. And so there's going to be extra code and extra testing that needs to happen. DevOps may be involved in this as well because we have, maybe we're wanting to add automated testing in our continuous integration, for example. So they're going to probably have a little bit of extra work there. So there's definitely considerations there. With the developers, depending on their skill set regarding accessibility, there may be some training needed. So that might be important to consider. And testing and quality assurance. They're going to be doing that testing for accessibility to validate that, hey, the changes that we're making are actually making the application more accessible. So they're definitely going to be involved. Whether that's via automation, whether that's manual, and again, DevOps, right? Because of being able to put any automation testing into our pipelines. And finally, legal, compliance, HR, those types of roles, because that accessibility statement, right, that we wrote, they probably need to review it, right, because it's representing their company. Any kind of legal representation to make sure that, hey, we are utilizing and following the standards that we are legally required to follow. Based on whatever, not all projects do have legal requirements, but some definitely do. So making sure that those are being followed. So it's a combination of for the content, for things like accessibility statement, but also making sure we're doing all the right things we need to do according to whatever contract or legal requirements we're bound to. So those are kind of our team roles. And when we look at our team, when we incentivize people, we optimize for reward, but when we inspire people, we optimize for purpose. And what we want to do here is optimize for purpose. We want to get that application accessible, right? That's the purpose. So how do we incentivize people? Well, there's really 4 big motivators. We have ethical, legal, economic, and personal. Your ethical is probably going to be the most effective because it's somebody doing it because they feel ethically obliged to do it. Which, I mean, accessibility and giving equal access to our content, it's a pretty big ethical input that we have based upon us as developers. Legal, are we, contractually based? You don't have a choice, right? That's big motivation. Not getting sued, it's pretty big motivation. Economic, in the United States alone, there's 49 million people with disabilities whom control an estimated 175 billion in discretionary income. For any business, this can represent about 20% of the market. So there's a real big, and this can be a nice heavy hitter for convincing leadership. If you can't get your leadership to get on board, is that realistically, there's a big economic advantage to being able to be accessible. And then personal, maybe you have a friend or a family member or are personally impacted by not having access to something or having some accessibility hindrances. So that could be another motivator. But those are kind of your 4 categories. And most people have multiples of these influencing them to want to do accessibility. But those are ways that you can motivate your leadership and your team. So lastly, we have our motivations, we have our team, we have what we need to do. let's create a plan, right? We need a plan to get this done. And so our plan can kind of fall out into 4 pieces. First off is finding your allies. And so once you've figured out who your team is, you've already pretty much done this piece, because you're probably, as you're discussing accessibility with your team, figure out who's really gung-ho about it, who's really excited about it. And those are going to be some of your driving forces behind motivating the rest of your team to get it done. So lean on people, right? This is also where we need to figure out things and ask ourselves questions like, what is our team's skill and awareness of accessibility? Do we need to secure some training? Do we need to allow time in our timelines for a learning curve? Because accessibility, and this is a whole new set of skills and techniques that maybe our team is not aware of. And so there's going to be a learning curve, right? And again, do we need to revise our team agreements and our procedures regarding coding, regarding testing? Do we need to acquire or test out some tools? So those are all questions we need to be asking in this phase. And the next phase, we're going to start with the big ones. In any application, we're going to have areas that are going to be a lot easier to fix. And we're going to have areas that are going to be impact large amounts of the application. So if we think of our navigation bar, right, it's available on the top of any website, and it's on every page. Those are the things that I'm referring to with the big wins. So your things that are on every page that are really impactful and that are going to apply to a large portion of your application. We're also going to fix low-hanging fruit, because those are quick, easy wins that make you feel good and make you, get a nice, healthy, effective start to being accessible. The other thing we want to do in this phase is kind of narrow down our tools. Yes.
Martine, sorry, not to be rude, just cutting in, just letting you know, due to timing, also the next speaker, I don't know how much you still have in your story, but if you could like wrap it up in a minute, that would be amazing. Thank you very much.
I could do that. We can focus on features. That's the next piece. Now that we've got the easy wins done, we're going to focus on our features, which features are going to be, as we develop new, and especially as we develop new ones. This is where focus groups come into play to help us with getting those features done. New development, obviously, as we create new development, we're going to want to make sure that all of that is being tested, both manually and automated, and that regression testing what we've done to make sure it all plays nice together. This is a really good time to do for potentially doing an external audit, especially if you have a team that is new to accessibility, because it may discover things that you may have missed completely, or validate that, hey, you're doing everything and you're doing a really good job, and keep going at it, right? And finally, we want to document so that you can go ahead and scale. Maybe your next project or the next team in your company wants to start down their accessibility journey. So you can document what you've done and how you've implemented everything. If you want to know more, I've got a book, Approachable Accessibility, that has a lot more detail on everything we've covered today. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed, and hope this helps in getting you started on your accessibility journey.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Martine. Sorry for the interruption. Didn't want to be rude, but we already had the other one coming in.
Totally understand.
Super cool. Love the insights that you're giving. I'm always happy to see like the accessibility presentations, because I think it's really important. I also understand it, and that there's still so much work to be done. So thank you so much. Not to be hasty, but we're moving to the last speaker of OpenSlava. The third day is almost to an end. It goes so fast.